And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Everett. Without any further ado, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I thought I'd spend a few minutes today and just look a little bit more near term at what the options are for Japan to move forward on electric power generation. Just as a quick overview, before the earthquake, and other speakers have mentioned this, about 20% or so Japan's generating capacity was nuclear. 25% of the nuclear capacity was destroyed or damaged by the quake. Now, Japan is going to need new generating capacity for its future growth, and it's going to need to replace what's been lost. We saw also from Jim's presentation that the public opposition is currently rather high, but the choices are limited. It's nice to be aspirational about long-term generating technology, and I think we are all hopeful that over time the number of choices that we have to generate electric power will grow, but right now there really aren't a whole lot. This is just basically showing you Japan's generating capacity today, and you'll notice it's highly diversified. That's not an accident. That's by specific government policy: coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear, and hydro. And if we look at it by company, there are 10 regional utilities in Japan. Tokyo Electric is the biggest one, Kansai, Chubu, Kyushu, Tohoku, and 5 smaller ones. I'd like to focus on Tokyo Electric, TEPCO, because it's the largest and probably because it's got the biggest problem of all of these companies. Before the earthquake, this is what TEPCOs look like. A lot of natural gas, 3 large nuclear power plants, and just a little bit of coal. Just after the accident, they had lost not only 2 of the 3 nuclear power plants, but also one of the major oil-fired units was severely damaged during the quake. And since that time, they've been able to get a little bit more thermal capacity, including restarting a previously mothballed oil unit. The reason that the nuclear has continued to decline is that their 3rd undamaged power plant, Kashiwazaki, has got some units offline for normal maintenance and repair. And this is going to be a political issue to get these basically restarted. So even with everything they've been able to do over the last few months, you can see they're quite short of generating capacity. Now, the good news is that TEPCO's service area is highly compact. They have 45 million people, extensive interconnections with neighboring utilities. At least on Honshu and the southern part of the country, the connections are quite extensive. Not so much for the north, but there aren't so many people there. Relatively low-cost transmission and distribution. If you just think about this very compact area and compare that to, for example, people in Los Angeles trying to draw hydropower from the Columbia River 1,200 miles away, or those of us in Boston trying to get power from James Bay in Quebec 800 miles away, the transmission locally around Tokyo is not a severe problem. The climate is relatively mild. We don't have the kinds of horrible problems we had in Texas over the summer with a heat wave. And we don't have the kinds of problems we have in Boston or Chicago, where during the winter people will die in prolonged power shortages during cold periods. And I guess the third point is that TEPCO is an experienced company, has extensive technical and managerial capabilities. Now, the bad news is that, unlike the United States and many other countries, all power generation fuels must be imported. Now, that's true for nuclear, although I think, as Jim mentioned, the economic component of the imports for nuclear fuel are very tiny, and you can essentially look at it as a domestic resource. Everything else, oil, natural gas, coal, has to be imported. Land and labor are costly in Japan. Electricity in Japan is already expensive. It's my view that electricity costs are important to economic growth, and when you start out with a high level of cost before the accident, you're constrained in terms of what you can do to recover from it to continue to grow. Just to give you an example, it's about 25 cents per kilowatt hour. Average cost in SA is about half that. TEPCO, which used to be one of the most creditworthy countries in the world, is now stretched by a real loss of revenue, Their share price has fallen 80%, which makes capital acquisition difficult, and they're still faced with compensation issues that they're going to need to deal with. So they're trying to do some very expensive things under very difficult circumstances. This is what TEPCO's load curve looks like. Unlike oil, for example, which is easily stored, a refiner doesn't care when you gas up your car. He just cares how much gasoline you're going to use over the next month or two. Electricity is very difficult to store, and as a result, a utility has to be able to generate it as it's needed. And you can see this looks like most load curves. During the night it's low. As people go to work, it gets high, and then late in the evening it starts to decline. And prior to the accident, this is how TEPCO met its requirements. Down the bottom is hydronuclear coal and some liquefied natural gas. These are called base load. These are the power plants that run all the time. And then they have liquefied natural gas and oil, which gives them the flexibility to grow demand, to meet growth demand during the course of the day, and then to cut it back at night. TEPCO and some of the other Japanese utilities also have one other tool that's available. Just due to the topography of Japan, they have something called pump storage. Basically 2 lakes of water, one at a high level, one at a low level, a tunnel in between with a turbine, and during the nighttime you can pump the water up to the top, and then during the daytime you can let the water run down through the tunnel and generate electricity. This is what one of TEPCO's pump storage plants looks like. So this is what they actually do. During the night, they actually burn oil, charge up the pump storage reservoirs, and then that gives them extra capacity during the day. Now, you'll notice here, this is a great deal of oil. This would be unusual for an American utility. You might see this in some places in New England, but oil in the United States in total is less than 1% of our power generation fuel at this point. But basically what's happened now is that TEPCO has lost a great deal of their base load power capacity. And in the immediate future, that's what they're going to need to address. Now, I want to show you a little bit about what's available to us today in terms of power generation. And in my class, I suggest to my students that they look at these power generation costs in terms of 3 components. Now, what I'm going to show you here is these are US costs from the DOE. Costs in Japan are higher, but they're generally uniformly higher. So I think it's going to be, the relative comparison is going to be about right. What we're showing here is how much does it cost to install the capacity to generate 1 watt of power. Okay? And you can see nuclear is very expensive, coal less so, NGCC is natural gas combined cycle, and I've shown you on the right-hand side offshore wind, solar PV, and onshore wind. Now this is only part of the equation, and this is what leads a lot of people to say, well, gee, you know, renewables are starting to look fairly comparable. But we have to turn to the second part of the equation, which is how many watt hours per year can 1 watt of capacity generate. If it could run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, it would be 8,760 watts per year. That would be 100%. This is what it's actually like. Now, nuclear power plants, because they are so expensive, utilities run them as long as they possibly can. Because as we'll see in a moment, the fuel costs are very, very small. TEPCO uses 80% for its coal and natural gas. You can run those units a little bit better than that if you need to. But here's where renewables have a problem. Because you can only get wind and solar power when nature gives it to you. And this causes 2 problems. One is you don't get very many watt hours per year for each installed watt. And the second is you don't necessarily get it when you want it. So if we combine these 2 components, and we look at the capital cost per kilowatt hour, you can see that our renewables are starting to look very expensive, and our nuclear and thermal are starting to look much better. Then we'll add the third piece, which is to add the fuel and the variable operating costs. And these fuel costs are for Japan. So what you can see is that nuclear, coal, and natural gas are roughly similar in terms of their costs per baseload power. But the renewables are getting more expensive. I also want to add here, using oil in existing power plants is very expensive. Okay? And you can see there's beginning to be some interesting things